have begun with this first one, and we have follow-up ones in May and June. Thank you to everybody who signed up. This is a wonderful turnout. Um, Thank you to Mae Jean Daniels and Karen Stuck for the advertising. Big thanks to Mary Bloodworth, without whom this technical recording would never have happened. And thanks, of course, to Judy Berman, without whom Village activities wouldn't take place at all. Tonight we have with us Charles King, and he has written a book that I think many of us have read, giving the context in which the Messiah was written. And that's what he's going to talk about tonight. He is a professor of government and international affairs at Georgetown. He's written books on things as various as uh, anthropologists, as a hotel in Constantinople, and has found time to teach at the same time and do a lot of things for international broadcast media. So we're very lucky to have him, and we're very lucky because one of our members, Christine Healy, knew that he lived here on Capitol Hill. And so he is a Capitol Hill resident with this wonderful book that he's going to talk to us about tonight. So with that, welcome, Charles.
Thanks very much, Trudy. And thanks to Mary and all the other organizers. I'm absolutely delighted to be with you, not least because this is a rather auspicious day. It is April 13th. It is the birthday of Handel's Messiah. So I'm glad you invited me to talk today, although I do have to put a little asterisk on that because after Messiah premiered, 10 years, in fact, after Messiah premiered, the United Kingdom underwent a calendar change, and they added 11 days to their calendar to bring their calendar in line with what we know as the modern calendar, then the continental calendar that was in use. So we can arm wrestle about whether April 13th or April 24th is the real birthday of Messiah. But for our purposes, we'll imagine that we're in 1742 and we've still got the old style calendar on the books. So I thought I would share a few images with you and talk for about half an hour or so, and then open it up to questions and conversation. This is a book project that I started in the middle of the pandemic because my wife and I were thinking a lot about the state of the world and despair and the possibility of hope. And we happened to put this music on. My wife's a singer, although she does music from the 1920s and 30s, not from the 1720s and 1730s. But we put this music on because we both love it. And when the first strains of this music came out from the speakers, we both just burst into tears in hearing those very first words that have been sung in every performance of Messiah since 1742. Comfort ye, my people, saith your God. Speak ye comfortably to Jerusalem and cry unto her, and get these words, and cry unto her that her warfare is accomplished, meaning that it's done, it's finished. Her iniquity is pardoned. And those words hit us kind of hard now in our current moment, and they have hit audiences for different reasons, with a kind of gut punch since the spring of 1742. And so I wanted to follow that feeling in a way. And that took both Maggie, my wife, and I on this incredible journey to Venice and to London and to a battlefield in Scotland and to an old moor in Leicestershire and a beach forest and a lost temple to love. And it just took us to all of these exotic, amazing places, to the eastern shore of Maryland, not too far away, which has a connection to the story, to Dublin, where the Messiah premiered in April of 1742. And the result is this book, and let me share, so I'll begin to share some of my images here. Hold on, let me share my screen. There we are. Hold on, wait, can you see that? Can you see? You see that fine? Okay. There's Every Valley. That's the cover of the book. Thank you for those of you who have had a chance to read it. Makes a terrific Mother's Day gift, if I may say. Um, so I wrote this book, Every Valley, the Desperate Lives and Troubled Times That Made Handel's Messiah. I wanted not to just tell the story of Handel himself. Of course, there are many wonderful biographies of Handel that you can read, but I wanted really to tell the story of the group of people that it took to make this work of genius. There really is no such thing, I think, as a lone artistic genius. There are always people behind the folks who are doing the sculpting, the painting, the writing, or in this case, the composing. And I wanted to tell their story. Um, if for those of you who are in the DC area, there's really a treasure at the Library of Congress that is unique in the world. And you can go to the music room and you can check it out. In fact, you can have it brought to your table. You can't take it home, but you can have it brought to your table. And it's this thing. It's the original word book, as it's called, or the program. The kind of thing that you might get, if you go to a Broadway musical today, the program from the first performance of Messiah in Dublin in 1742. And you can see this is what was printed. This is what people held in their hands. Messiah, an oratorio composed by Mr. Handel, and then it has, of course, a couple of little epigraphs there, a quote from the Bible, and then this quote in Latin, Majora conimus, let us sing of greater things. And that is what every audience, I think, who has heard this since it premiered has kind of felt. I mean, you go to any performance, there's some performances in the Easter season for which Messiah was written. We're more used to hearing it at Christmas time now, but you go to a live performance in either of those seasons, anytime during the year, and you look around and there will be people with tears in their eyes. It might even be you. And people feel very connected to this. They feel like they really are singing of greater things. And sometimes they're literally singing of greater things because this is the most sung along with piece of music in the classical canon. People go to sing-alongs. You go away from a performance humming some of the melodies. Messiah is an oratorio, which was a relatively new musical form, at least in English at the time. And I'll talk a bit more about this in a moment and why Handel as a composer began experimenting with it. But I say this is one of the treasures of the Library of Congress because this is the only one we know about in the world. It's the only remaining word book from that first performance. You can see it was printed in Dublin in 1742. Other performances had other word books, and we only have this one, the absolute original, because Gilbert and Sullivan bought it at some point and preserved it. And those two guys, it came from their collection of music. It just happened to be in there when some of their papers came, through a very roundabout way to the Library of Congress. So I think it's somehow appropriate that Handel, a composer for the stage, and Gilbert and Sullivan, great 19th century composers for the British stage, had this connection in this one very, very special little pamphlet. So we can't really talk about Messiah, of course, without talking about Handel himself. Sorry, Anne, did you have a question? I see a hand raised there. Okay, okay, you're all good. Okay, got it. I know. I want to make sure everybody can hear. I want to make sure everybody can hear. So this is, of course, George Friedrich Handel, the creator of the music for Messiah. He is so associated now with Britain, with British music. In fact, part of what it means to be British now, or English in particular, is probably having a bit of Handel rolling through your brain. When Charles III was crowned most recently, the current British monarch, Just as the crown was placed on his head, maybe some of you are watching this online from Westminster Abbey, when the crown was lowered on his head, there was a magnificent anthem being played called Zadok the Priest. It's a wonderful piece of music. If you haven't heard it, just YouTube it. You'll find it. Zadok the Priest. It's the thing that when the crown is lowered on the monarch's head, the choir bursts into full voice all of a sudden. It's like the heavens have opened up. That anthem was created in 1727 by Handel for the coronation of George II. And it's been played at every monarch's coronation since 1727 in exactly that kind of moment. This was an odd thing for a person like Handel, however, because he wasn't English at all. He wasn't British. He was a naturalized British citizen by the 1720s, but he was actually born in what would become Germany in the city of Halle. And he wasn't born into a musical family either. His father was a barber surgeon, back when those two professions were really the same thing, a barber surgeon. Um, his mother, in fact, his mother was the second wife of his father, and the idea was that in this professional but not wealthy family, that Handel would try to step the family up by going into law or some other profession that would be slightly higher on the social ladder. But he couldn't quite imagine doing that. He was one of these kids who is in love with music as soon as it's introduced to them. And the story goes, in fact, that his father, who wasn't too keen on this musical interest, that Handel sort of secreted into his bedroom a little clavichord, a kind of mini harpsichord, so that he could practice on his own without his father's hearing him. But at some point, his father relented and arranged for organ lessons with the local organ master at one of the churches in Halle, and Handel took to it like a duck to water. This is very different from the life of his exact contemporary. He was born about 100 miles away from and about a month apart from Johann Sebastian Bach. So the two of them were exact contemporaries, but they never met. And because they actually lived very different musical lives that I can talk about in a moment. Bach was deposited into an already very famous musical family. Handel's dad was a barber. And so he was a self-made musician. He went from being a church organist, which that lasted for about a year. Bach spent his entire career in one form or another in that role, but that lasted for about a year with Handel. And then he moved to Hamburg, started playing second violin in the opera house there, a very large and famous opera house in Hamburg. And before too long, he realized that if he wanted to make a career in music, there was only one place to go, and that was to Italy. Because if you think about it, if we talk about music now, we always break into a kind of pidgin Italian. Even if you don't speak Italian, you start speaking Italian when you talk about music, because you talk about something being piano or forte or fortissimo, pianissimo, a decrescendo, accelerando, something being andante, allegro. You're speaking Italian, whether you know it or not. And that's because at exactly this time, the late 17th, early 18th century, and Handel was born in 1685, so he's becoming a teenager in the early 18th century. This was the time when the Italians were inventing a way of thinking and talking systematically about music. All of those musical forms that we take for granted now, a concerto, a sonata, more Italian words, were being invented at that time by Italian composers and musicians. Even the piano, which had evolved from the old harpsichord. The harpsichord plucks the strings with little plectrums. The piano, of course, as you know, hammers a string with a little hammer. That technological innovation was just being invented and perfected at exactly this time. So Italy has this magnetic quality to it for anyone who's interested in music. And Handel spends the next several years, his late teens and early 20s, in in Italy, traveling around Naples, Rome, Florence, Venice, premiering some of his earliest compositions, perfecting his art as a composer and as a musician. He was extremely talented on the keyboard. And this is a moment, of course, when music that we now call the Baroque is coming to the fore. None of these people knew that they were in a period called the Baroque. That's a term that was given to this period by later classical composers for one important reason. The term Baroque comes from a Portuguese and a French word that means a kind of rough pearl, something that isn't quite perfect. Um, and the classical musicians of a later period, of Mozart and later, looked back on the Baroque as a kind of rule-breaking moment. These folks hadn't quite figured out how to do harmony properly. They wanted to keep notes dissonant and not quite in tune before finally bringing it into tune. Things that later classical composers thought of as kind of punk, if you like. And they gave it this punk name, Baroque. But that is exactly what thrilled young people like Handel. Keep in mind, these guys are young. They want to break the rules. They want to do something different. And that's why Italy is so attractive to people of Handel's generation. At one of the concerts, however, when he's performing in probably in Venice, there is a rather regionally famous family member who is there. It's the representative of the Dukes of Braunschweig-Lüneburg, which was a German area not too far from where Handel grew up. And they were so impressed with his musical skill and his composition, they invited him to come back to be the Kapellmeister, or in charge of the ducal palace's music. So if you were a proper duke and you had a proper palace, you had your own chapel, and of course that chapel had to have music, and so you needed people to compose music for your chapel services. They invited Handel to come back and do that, and he agreed. He had family in the German lands, and he wanted to be closer to them. This all made sense. There's no reason you should have heard of the Dukes of Braunschweig-Lüneburg, but you will have heard of what they became, because through an accident of history, in 1714, when the last Stuart monarch, Queen Anne, died, the British Parliament had decided that in order to ensure that a Protestant, not a Catholic, would sit on the British throne, that they would skip over about 50 claimants to the throne in order to find a safely Protestant family. And through all of the European dynastic intermarriages, the people they decided on were the Dukes of Braunschweig-Lüneburg. And so Georg Ludwig, the Duke of Braunschweig-Lüneburg, Georg became George, George the First. The Duke's ducal palace was in the city of Hanover, and that's why we call this dynasty the Hanoverian dynasty, who took power in 1714. They'll become, of course, very important in American history because not George the First and not George the Second, but George the Third will, of course, be king at the time of the American Revolution, the Hanoverian dynasty. When George the First comes to England to become King of Great Britain and Ireland, he brings along his Kapellmeister with him. And that's, of course, Handel. And so almost overnight, this barber's son, who had been an itinerant musician in Italy, becomes court composer to the most powerful monarch in the world. It's an incredible overnight success story. He also happens to be coming to London at a very particular time, because this is the moment when stage performance is taking off. Um, this area that we call the West End of London, the western reaches of the city, or what at the time was the western reaches of the city. It's now central London. But the theater district, if you've ever been there around Leicester Square and so on, where you go to see plays and musicals in London, this was just getting going. That was the western suburbs. There were new housing developments going in and new theaters going in the middle of these housing developments. Um, and the thing that people loved, that they were crazy about, was Italian opera. And imagine that. You've got the court composer to George the First, who has just spent the last 6 years in Italy perfecting his craft as a composer of, among other things, Italian operas. So Handel now has two jobs. He's composing things like Zadok the Priest for courtly events, coronations, and so on, but he's also composing music for the stage. And that's how we have to think of Handel. He is in many ways the anti-Bach. If Bach is composing for the church and Bach is cerebral and mathematic, Handel wants to rip your heart out. He wants you to feel. He wants you to feel what's going on stage because, among other things, his income depends on it. He's got to fill seats and he wants to make you sense what's happening on the stage, the drama in the middle of an opera, the comedy in the middle of an opera. And he's going to use every musical trick at his disposal to get you to do that. He comes to England with the Hanoverians. In fact, he had come a little bit earlier to London on his own. He's there through the 17 teens. He premieres this magnificent piece of music for one of George the First's outings on the Thames. We call it the water music now, or Handel's water music. That was premiered in 1717, but Handel thought of it as just like a set to accompany the king as he rode up the Thames to a dinner party in Chelsea. It would be as if somebody, you're at a cocktail party and there's a little jazz band in the corner. No one would think of like writing down all the music that the jazz band is playing in the corner at your cocktail party. But that's what happened with Handel's music. The water music was later set into a suite, and now orchestras play it in the great orchestral halls of the world. That was in 1770. He composes all these coronation anthems in 1727 for George II, the new king who comes to power after the death of George I. He's composing for the court, but also premiering new operas, things for the stage. And it means that by the 1730s or so, Handel is at the height of his power. There's a statue that's even erected to him in a pleasure garden in London called Ranelagh Gardens by the great French sculptor Roubiliac. This is a model of it here. You can see Handel as a kind of classical Orpheus. He's charming the world with his lyre. He is the consummate people's artist. Everyone knew him. Everyone had seen his work on the stage. He was at the height of his popularity. But it may have occurred to him at some point in all of this that if you're at the height of your popularity, there's only one place to go, and that's down. Um, it must have occurred to him that normally the people who get statues erected to them are people who are already dead. And Handel, but was by no means dead. He was in his mid 40s at this point. People had started, in a way, to turn against him. Um, he had composed Italian operas, but Italian operas were really no longer the fashion that they were before. There were new English operas where, lo and behold, you could actually understand the words that were being sung on stage. There's a little bit of a reaction against these foreign artists and foreign composers who had been piling into London over the last several decades. And people started really to make fun of Handel. He was a great gourmand. By this stage, he was pretty large. At least had a very substantial belly and a pretty substantial chin. Here's one of the cartoons that circulated at this time, showing him as a kind of pig sitting at the organ with game fowl and a ham and all sorts of other things, sort of draped from his instrument. The world had a little bit turned against him, and he was worrying kind of how to fill seats. And one of the things he started to do was to premiere this new musical form, or at least new in English musical form called an oratorio. An oratorio is essentially an opera that has been stripped down. So no sets, no costumes, no running about on stage, just standing there and singing. Um, and it was cheaper to produce as a result. You didn't have to pay people to build sets or to manufacture costumes. It's just people on stage singing, but with some kind of storyline that's taking place at the same time. And so he had been worrying about, how am I going to pay the bills? How am I going to pay my artists? How am I going to fill seats? And then at some point into his home in Mayfair in central London comes a package, a manuscript package. Handel had relied on friends, associates, to write the libretti, or the words, the book, as you would call it on Broadway today, for his operas. He collaborated with lots of different people before, but he received one that was really unsolicited from a man named Charles Jennens. Jennens was known to Handel. They had actually worked together on a few things before. But Jennens himself was not a musician. He was a country squire, one of the wealthiest landowners in Britain, from from the English Midlands, from the county of Leicestershire. He suffered, however, from a very particular ailment, despite his great wealth. And the ailment was what was called at the time the hip, HYP. The hip was short for hypochondria, but hypochondria didn't mean what we mean it as now, which is kind of an imaginary illness or an oversensitivity. In the 18th century, the hip was what we might now call chronic depression or bipolar disorder, even. And you could tell in Jennens's writings, we have about 100 of his letters that have survived. It's very clear when he's in a kind of manic state and when he's in a more depressed state. And at some point, we don't know exactly when, but maybe 1739, 1740 or so, he sat down in his extensive library in his home, which was called Gopsall Hall in Leicestershire, one of these grand old estate homes, a kind of Downton Abbey style palatial private home, and started copying down Bible verses. He was a believing Christian. He was a very serious religious believer. Handel was not particularly at this stage. He became more religious as he got older. But Jennens was very serious, and he started copying down Bible verses. And then you can imagine him almost copying them down on little slips of paper and moving them around his library table um, to put them in an order that made sense to him. Um, he called this thing he had created Messiah. And he wrote to a friend that he was going to ship off these pages to Handel because he thought the thing he had created was the greatest story ever told. He thought it was the greatest subject, as he told his friend Edward Holdsworth. And he hoped that Handel, his acquaintance, would lay all of his skill and genius on it in setting the thing to music. The point of all of this, Jennens felt, was to kind of react against the world as he found it. If you know the paintings and prints of the great artist of the time, the great social artist of the time, William Hogarth. Hogarth was very good at presenting the world of London and Britain as it was at the time. A place of war, a place of disease, a place mired in the muck of everyday urban life, where children were abandoned to their fate, where what we would now call alcohol and drug abuse was rampant, and where the poorer classes lived lives that were mean, nasty, brutish, and short, as Thomas Hobbes had said in the 17th century. Um, Messiah was Jennens' attempt to think himself out of this world by turning to the texts that he knew very well, to the scriptures. But that's why, if you listen to the text today, and when you hear the words of Messiah, you're listening to Jennings's words, Jennings's selections of scripture. They're in the order that Jennings wanted you to hear them in, because nothing in Messiah, um, as it's performed, is in the biblical order. We move back and forth between the Old Testament, the New Testament, the epistles, the book of Revelation, the prophet Isaiah, all back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. You're taking a journey that Jennings wanted you to be on. And that's also why those first words from the 40th chapter of the book of Isaiah are so important. Comfort ye my people. If you go to the biblical text in the King James Version, and that's the text that you're hearing, that's what Jennings used, the King James Version of the Bible. In that phrase, comfort ye my people, you may think it's saying, well, my people, comma, be comforted. But that's not actually what the text says at all. Comfort ye my people is a command from the prophet Isaiah to the Judean king. It's saying, you be the one. You go and comfort my people. You comfort my people. So when you're hearing that on stage now, what you're hearing is Jennings telling you, and therefore telling himself, that in a world that looks like a Hogarth painting, it's up to you. It's up to you to do the comforting, to change the world as you find it. It's an incredibly powerful message, and it's why audiences for the last more than 2 centuries have found it so compelling. So Handel gets this in the post, or the equivalent of it, doesn't quite know what to do with it. I got a bunch of Bible verses in the wrong order with no characters. There's only one named character in Messiah. The word Emmanuel appears. No other named characters. If you're going to write an oratorio, you got to have a storyline. You got to have some characters. This has none of that stuff. And it's all sacred scripture, which, like, how are you going to sing sacred scripture on a secular stage? But he finally gets around in August and September of 1741 to start composing for it. And here is a page from the original manuscript. It's actually the first page. You can see up at the upper left-hand corner, he's written Messiah and Oratorio, part the first part. And as you may know, Messiah is divided into 3 parts about prophecy, the prophecy of a Messiah, the middle part, the passion of the Christ, and then the third part about resurrection and glory and the transcendent nature of the message of Jesus. He composes at an absolutely furious rate. This is the page that shows us the most famous bit of Messiah today, the Hallelujah chorus. And you can see as he gets to the final Hallelujah there, his composing becomes wider and wider and wider. He's almost enacting on the page the final bit of the Hallelujah chorus. Hallelujah. And he's even writing that on the page. You can see he put at the bottom that he had finished this bit of it on September 6th, 1741. He always notated when he had finished it. And that little circle with a dot in the middle of it down in the lower right-hand corner, he always put the astrological symbol for the day. That was a Sunday. September 6th, 1741 was a Sunday when he composed that part. But as you know, if you've sat through an entire performance of Messiah, people start to jangle their keys and find their parking validation at the end of the Hallelujah chorus. But wait, there's a third, as they say on those TV commercials, but wait, there's more. There's a third more of this thing left to go. Hallelujah chorus is not the end of Messiah. It comes only about 2/3 of the way through. And so Handel carried on composing.
Yeah,
Um, At some point,
Hey,
one of the wonderful bits of the original manuscript is that at some point somebody knocked over a pot of ink on the manuscript. This may have been Handel himself in his furious composing, or a very, very, very worried maid or valet who knocked this thing over. But somebody quickly sort of wiped it up because you can see the composition beneath it. You can see the notes beneath this thing. He composed this in only 24 days. 24 days to create the entirety of music for Jennings's libretto. That was not unusual for Handel, however, for the reason that I mentioned earlier. He composed for the stage. And you gotta compose quickly. You're always facing a deadline, as Handel was now, because he had received an invitation from the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland to come and do a series of concerts in Dublin. He had never been to Ireland before. He had not spent much time outside London, at least in other parts of the United Kingdom, but he decided to go in part because he thought it was a good way of restarting his career. It was a kind of greatest hits tour. As you know, if you go on a greatest hits tour, that's a little bit of a sign of where you are in the arc of your career, however. Um, but he decided to go, and he took along with him this new composition because he was going to go to Dublin at the end of 1741, stay through the Easter season of 1742, and he thought Messiah, this new thing he had composed using Genesis text, would be a good thing to use then, because you couldn't perform opera during the Lenten season. It thought to be sort of too frivolous for Lent, but you could perform oratorios. Um, and this would fit exactly right because it was, of course, a story of um, the essential truths of Christianity as Jennings saw it. Because Easter, not Christmas, was until relatively recently the principal Christian holiday. Without the Easter story, you don't have a religion. You have to have the Easter story to have Christianity. Um, and so this was what was going to be performed in Dublin. He got to Dublin. He started looking around for artists to perform. He didn't travel with an orchestra, didn't travel with singers. He put together musicians wherever he could find them. And he happened to come upon this woman, Susanna Cibber, who was in Dublin at the same time. He knew Cibber. She had, as a much younger woman, had sung for him in London in a very minor part many, many years ago. But she was in Dublin not to restart her career so much as to restart her life, because she had been a young ingenue, a star of the London stage. She wasn't a particularly good singer, but she was a very good actor and could do for acting what Handel was doing for music. That is, to really make you feel a thing, to sort of empathize with a character on stage. But she had contracted a marriage, or I should say, a marriage had been contracted for her by her father with a young man named Theophilus Cibber, who in some ways was a catch. He was the son of the poet laureate of England, a very famous theater manager. But in other ways, he was a nightmare. He slept his way around the cast. He was frequently drunk on stage. He was an actor, or a so-called actor himself. And even worse, he decided that this young, rather famous ingenue, beautiful wife of his would be a good person to put before men who had agreed to pay his bar tab or to pay his debts. And he essentially acted as a kind of broker for meetings between his wife and other men. Some of those were just, the equivalent of sign an autograph at the stage door. Others of them were probably more than that. Um, at some point, Susanna Cibber, if not fell in love with, then certainly turned to one of these men, a man named William Sloper, whom she had met in this way, to try to get out of this horrible marriage that she was in. Um, and when Theophilus found out about this, he sued. because now she was involved in what he thought of as a relationship, not a business transaction. He couldn't sue her. Well, he could sue her for divorce, but that would be very, very expensive, and it would have taken away the golden goose that he had created. But he sued the man. He sued William Sloper for the alienation of affection of his wife. And this was a celebrated, scandalous celebrity trial in 1738 in London. It was so celebrated and so scandalous that people started creating cartoons about it and taking down the transcript of the trial and then rushing out to Fleet Street to have it be printed. Here's a kind of semi-pornographic cartoon from the time, a cartoon of Theophilus Cibber. He's there on the left in his stage costume with her lover, William Sloper, pulling the covers back from her, and of course, a naked image of Susanna Cibber. All of this was aired in a London courtroom. Um, Theophilus won a little bit of money from this trial, although not as much as he wanted. But he realized that so long as the two of these people stayed together, he could just keep suing again and again and again. And he sued again in 1739 and won a little bit more money. But by this stage, of course, Susanna's life was ruined. She couldn't appear on stage anymore. The most intimate details of her life were now public. She was being made fun of. And so she decided to disappear. And she was gone for about 2 years and then popped up again in Dublin just at the time that Handel arrives. And she's starring in a few sort of stage productions out in the provinces, as Londoners would have thought of it then. Handel realized that she could handle some, as it were, some singing. Um, and he decided to to cast her in the premiere of this new work and to give her some of the easiest pieces to sing, rather low in her alto-ish, mezzo-soprano alto kind of register with nothing too fancy. And so on April 13th, old style, 1742, people started to gather at Neil's Music Hall in Fishamble Street in Dublin. That's my lovely wife Maggie. They're right in front of it. This is all that's left today. It's a set of condos, but that's the facade of this music hall. Not a church, not a chapel, but a music hall where 700 or so people were packed into this building to hear the premiere of this new sacred oratorio that Handel was putting before the public. Um, the thing that made people remember this event, however, is the fact that throughout it, people were quiet. The audience was quiet. That's not what you would do in an opera. You would talk at the stage and throw things and talk to your friends and have something to eat. But throughout this, through the 3.5 hours of this performance, people were quiet. They knew they were hearing something special, especially when Susanna Cibber stepped forward from the choir to sing because Handel had given her um, a piece that was easy to sing but hard to perform. And her talents came to the fore. It was that bit, you will know it if you know Messiah. It's that amazing aria, He was despised. He was despised, rejected, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. It's, of course, speaking in the Christian tradition about the passion of the Christ, but everyone in the room could do the gender switch. She was a woman of sorrows. She was acquainted with grief because they knew her story from the newspapers and the pornographic cartoons. They knew who she was. And so the great fact of the premiere of Messiah, which is a piece of music after all, about the possibility of human redemption, is that for the people experiencing it on April 13, 1742, they saw an act of redemption played out before them. Susanna Cibber appearing again on a stage. She would go on to become the most important tragedian of the 18th century. She would go back to London, have this magnificent career. This would restart Handel's career as well. It would become the greatest piece of music that he created that we now remember. And the really amazing thing is that the two of them now, Cibber and Handel, lie about a wall apart in Westminster Abbey. Handel, with his magnificent monument in the main sanctuary, and Cibber out in the cloisters. She was Catholic and so couldn't be in the main hall, but the two of them are reunited there. Just to show you a few more things before I close, that's the original manuscript, which is part of the research for Every Valley I had a chance to see. That's in the British Library. They took it out of the vault for me, brought it up. It survived the Blitz. It survived all of these centuries, and it's still one of the great treasures of the British Library and one of the great treasures of the world, in fact. You may wonder whatever happened to Charles Jennens in all of this. Well, Jennens was at one of the London premieres in 1743. He wasn't particularly happy with what Handel had created and gave him plenty of notes on how he might change this bit or that bit. And Handel did make some changes. And Jennens, in the end, said that he thought it was, in the main, a fine composition. But he had no idea what it would become. And in fact, it took me a little bit of effort to track down where Charles Jennens is buried. He's buried in a little church in Leicestershire, out of the way. That's his funereal monument. It's in a little back room that the church uses for storing old cans of paint and a ladder. That's the monument to Charles Jennens. And it never mentions his role in creating Messiah. But we should really call this thing not Handel's Messiah, but Handel's and Jennens's Messiah. It took the both of them to create it in an entire world to make it immortal. I'll stop there. I've talked a little bit longer than I intended, but I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks, folks. And I'm going to stop my share.
Well, thanks, Charles. That was just a wonderful, wonderful recap of what is laid out in much more detail in your book. And I have to encourage people to read it if they have liked this little taste of it. I'm sure we've got a lot of people with questions, but let me start simply by asking, why did Jennings get so forgotten in the story?
I'm afraid it's kind of an easy answer in a way. Um, it is the fate of the lyricist. I'm so sorry to say. It is people remember George Gershwin and they tend to forget Ira. They know Elton John and tend to forget Bernie Taupin. But it's got kind of what happens to the folks who write the words. But it's also because Jennings really didn't seek any credit for this. He didn't think that this was his great contribution to really much of anything. He and Handel did a few other things together, but he didn't imagine that this would become the work that it's become. And one of the things I wanted to do in Every Valley was to kind of resurrect Jennings and his role. It's his idea, it's his creation, and then the two of them came together, words and music, to create the thing we know now.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Mary, help me. Do we have hands up?
We do. Avis has her hand up.
Okay. Avis, hello. Unmute
if you're
yourself.
able to unmute.
There you
There
go.
you go.
Thank you very, very much for this fascinating thing. I love the book and
Oh, thank you.
encourage everybody to read it. But I've also loved all your other books.
Oh, you're very kind.
The book about now.
Thank you. I lost just the last. Sorry, I lost just the last bit of that, but I'm so glad that you read the other books. Thank you.
It was a question whether you're writing another book now.
Oh, I am. Yes, I'm deep in the middle of a book on. I was telling Trudy earlier, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. but not the entire history of Rome. It's a book about Edward Gibbon and the writing of this book called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. So I'm sticking in the 18th century. It's an incredibly fascinating story. There's a love story, an unrequited love story at the core of it. So I'm privileged to get to spend some time with this very odd and very interesting figure, Edward Gibbon.
Yeah.
Can't wait.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Who
I
else
think
do we have?
Chris Birch had her hand up.
All right.
Let's see if I can
I think
add.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, yes, thank you for the book. I enjoyed it very much.
Thanks.
And I think you know a little about this. I'm just going to make a statement and then ask you to comment.
Yep.
This past summer, the Stanton Music Festival put on a stage version of The Messiah.
Yeah.
Fortunately, you weren't able to join us.
Yeah.
But the thing that struck me most about it was having heard The Messiah many times, a stage version made me hear the words in a way I'd never heard them before, or it awakened me to the words in a very, very different way. And just ask you to comment on
I think that's brilliant. Yeah, I'm so sorry. We were traveling. We were in the UK in the summer, and so I couldn't attend. But I would love to have seen it because I think you're right. This is Messiah is so much a part of the background music of the Christmas season. I've sometimes called it the Sonic Pumpkin Spice Latte of the of that season, and so you can forget how powerful these words are. I went to a performance last season of the 13, which is a local magnificent choral group here in DC. And I thought they were doing it in oratorio style, not stage, but it was as if they were singing the words for the first time. And I heard them differently in this performance as well. So I think that's brilliant.
And just one other comment before I go. The other thing was, it's a lovely little town, a very progressive town, and it was held in a beautiful, beautiful church. But a few people were rather upset that the person in the Passion scene that was the Christ was female.
Oh, well.
Yes, such it was.
Mary, who else has hands up?
Okay, I'm not seeing anyone right now, so you may have to unmute yourself if you have a question or raise your hand in anything out there.
Charles, talk a little bit about the politics that were going on at the time when Jennings is selecting all this.
Yeah. That's an important part of the story that I didn't mention, and that is, of course, that it's so in every imaginable way, Jennings and Handel were opposites. Jennings was a very dark figure. Handel was very jolly. Most of the time, of course, Jennings was English. Handel was a naturalized British subject, but originally German. But politically, they were as far apart as you could get. The great divide in the middle of the 18th century was who the legitimate king dynasty of Britain was. Was it the old Stuarts who had been exiled, and there was still a Stuart pretender to the throne in Paris and then later in Rome, or the new Hanoverians whom Handel served? Jennings was what was at the time called a Tory, who sort of supported the old kings, but he leaned what was called Jacobite, meaning that he would not have been sad, let me put it this way, if the old Stuarts had forcibly come back and retaken power. And for any of you who know your Scottish history, or have watched the show Outlander, for example, you will know that in 1745, the Stuarts tried exactly to do that. They launched a rebellion in Scotland via the son of the pretender to the throne, a person named Charles Edward Stuart, or Bonnie Prince Charlie, as he would later be known. And they came very close to succeeding. The Scottish army invaded England. They were inside the borders of England. They were only a few miles away from Gopsall Hall before they decided, perhaps stupidly, looking at it now, to turn around and go back to Scotland. That allowed the British forces to pursue them and ultimately to crush them at the Battle of Culloden in the spring of 1746. So these were like people on totally opposite sides of a grand canyon of politics that actually, in many ways, makes our political divides now look rather shallow. This was about whether the legitimate person was on the throne, and that had huge theological implications as well. Whether, God had made a mistake in bringing the Hanoverians to power.
Mhm. So all like sheep have gone astray.
All like sheep have gone astray. Exactly right.
Okay, thank you so much, Charles. And before we go, let me talk a little bit about the next two programs.
Oh, okay.
Um, uh, the next one is on Nigeria, and we have former U.S. Ambassador to Nigeria, John Campbell, and Consul General Robin Hinson Jones. Now, if you remember, on Christmas Day of 2025, the U.S. Did a missile attack in northern Nigeria, and we actually have boots on the ground there. And so, what we're going to do is we're going to have these two very distinguished, very knowledgeable people talk about Nigeria and its great variety of peoples and the tensions that are in that country. So, yes, okay, led astray again. And that is on Tuesday, May 5, Tuesday at 7 o'clock. And then on Monday, June 8, to close out our spring season, we have Marcus Kidd. And he has been doing a one-man show at Chaw's, the Capitol Hill Arts Workshop, with the Taffety Punk Company. And he has taken Beowulf and turned it into a one-man show. So we're going to talk to Marcus about how did he decide to take Beowulf and turn it into a one-man show? What did he have to do to this wonderful old English text, or Danish text if you are particular about it, and give us the version of Beowulf that he has so well articulated. It is a Helen Hayes nomination, by the way, for his work on Beowulf. And so everybody watch and see if our own Marcus Kidd is a winner of the Helen Hayes. So that is on Monday, June 8th. And with that, we will close our spring season. We will take off as we usually do in July and August, and we'll be back in September. So thank you, everybody. And thank you, Charles, for a wonderful evening. And everybody, read the book. It's really good.
Thanks, bye. Thanks very much.